History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 2, A New World Order. Latin America. After 1945, Latin America was again to reflect a changing international situation. While United States policy was dominated by European concerns in the early phase of the Cold War, after Korea, it began slowly to look southwards again. Washington was not unduly alarmed by occasional manifestations of Latin American nationalism, for all its anti Yankee flavor, but became increasingly concerned lest the hemisphere provide a lodgment for Russian influence. With the Cold War came greater selectivity in United States support to Latin American governments. It led at times to covert operations. For example, to overthrow in 1954 of a government in Guatemala that had communist support. At the same time, United States policymakers were anxious that the footholds provided for communism by poverty and discontent should be removed. They provided more economic aid. Latin America had only a tiny fraction of what went to Europe and Asia in the 1950s, but much more in the next decade, and applauded governments that said they sought social reform. Unfortunately, whenever the programs of such governments moved towards the eradication of American control of capital by nationalization, Washington tended to veer away again, demanding compensation on such a scale as to make reform very difficult. On the whole, therefore, while it might deplore the excesses of an individual authoritarian regime, such as that of Cuba before 1958, the American government tended to find itself, as in Asia, supporting conservative interests in Latin America. This was not invariably so. Some governments acted effectively, notably Bolivia, which carried out land reform in 1952. But it remained true that, as for most of the previous century, the worst of Latin Americans had virtually no hearing from either populist or conservative rulers, in that both listened only to the towns. The worst of course, were the peasant, for the most part American Indians by origin. Yet, for all the nervousness in Washington, there was little revolutionary activity in Latin America. This was in spite of the victorious revolution in Cuba, of which much was hoped and feared at the time. It was, in a number of respects, a very exceptional problem. Cuba's location within a relatively short distance of the United States gave it special significance. The approaches to the canal zone had often been shown to have even more importance in American strategic thinking than Suez in the British. Secondly, Cuba had been specially badly hit in the Depression. It was virtually dependent on one crop, sugar, and that crop had only one outlet, the United States. This economic tie, moreover, was the only one of several that gave Cuba a closer and more irksome special relationship with the United States than had any other Latin American state. There were historic connections that went back before 1898 and the winning of independence from Spain. Until 1934, the Cuban Constitution had included special provisions restricting Cuba's diplomatic freedom. The Americans still kept their naval base on the island. There was heavy American investment in urban property and utilities, and Cuba's poverty and low prices made it attractive to Americans looking for gambling and girls. All in all, it should not have been surprising that Cuba produced, as it did, a strongly anti American movement with much popular support. The United States was long blamed as the real power behind the conservative post war Cuban regime, although after the dictator Batista came to power in 1952. This, in fact, ceased to be so. The State Department disapproved of him and cut off help to him in 1957. By then, a young nationalist lawyer, Fidel Castro, had already begun a guerrilla campaign against his government. In 2 years, he was successful. In 1959, as Prime Minister of a new revolutionary Cuba, he described his regime as humanistic and specifically not communist. Castro's original aims are still not known. Perhaps he was not clear himself what he thought. From the start, he worked with a wide spectrum of people who wanted to overthrow Batista, from liberals to Marxists. This helped to reassure the United States, which briefly patronized him as a Caribbean Sukarno. American public opinion idolized him as a romantic figure, and beards became fashionable among American radicals. The relationship quickly soured once Castro turned to interference with American business interests, starting with agrarian reform and the nationalization of sugar concerns. He also denounced publicly those Americanized elements in Cuban society that had supported the old regime. Anti Americanism was a logical means, perhaps the only one, open to Castro for uniting Cubans behind the revolution. Soon the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba and began to impose other kinds of pressures as well. The American government became convinced that the island was likely to fall into the hands of the communists, upon whom Castro increasingly relied. It did not help when the Soviet leader Khrushchev warned the United States of the danger of retaliation from Soviet rockets if it acted militarily against Cuba and declared the Monroe Doctrine dead. The State Department quickly announced that reports of its demise were greatly exaggerated. Finally, the American government decided to promote Dr. Castro's overthrow by force. It was agreed that this should be done by Cuban exiles. When the presidency changed hands in 1961, John Kennedy inherited this decision. Exiles were already training with American support in Guatemala, and diplomatic relations with Cuba had been broken off. Kennedy had not initiated these activities, but he was neither cautious nor thoughtful enough to impede them. This was the more regrettable because there was much else that boded well in the new president's attitude to the Latin America, where it had been obvious for some time that the United States needed to cultivate goodwill. As it was, the possibilities of a more positive approach were almost at once blown into pieces by the fiasco known as the Bay of Pigs operation, when an expedition of Cuban exiles, supported by American money and arms, came to a miserable end in April 1961. Castro now turned in earnest towards Russia and at the end of the year declared himself a Marxist Leninist. A new and much more explicit phase of the Cold War then began in the Western Hemisphere and began badly for the United States. The American initiative incurred disapproval everywhere because it was an attack on popular, solidly based regime. Henceforth, Cuba was a magnet for Latin American revolutionaries. Castro's torturers replaced Batista's, and his government pressed forward with policies that, together with American pressure, badly damaged the economy and embodied egalitarianism and social reform. In the 1970s, Cuba claimed to have the lowest child mortality rates in Latin America. Almost incidentally, and as a byproduct of the Cuban Revolution, there soon took place the most serious superpower confrontation of the whole Cold War and perhaps its turning point. It is not yet known exactly why or when the Soviet government decided to install in Cuban missiles capable of reaching anywhere in the United States, and thus roughly to double the number of American bases or cities that were potential targets. Nor is it known whether the initiative came from Havana or Moscow, although Castro had asked the USSR for arms. It seems likeliest that it was the second. But whatever the circumstances, American photographic reconnaissance confirmed in October 1962 that the Russians were building missile sites in Cuba. President Kennedy waited until this could be shown to be incontrovertible and then announced that the United States Navy would stop any ship delivering further missiles to Cuba and that those already in Cuba would have to be withdrawn. One Lebanese ship was boarded and searched in the days that followed. Soviet ships were only observed. The American nuclear striking force was prepared for war. After a few days and some exchanges of personal letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the latter agreed that the missiles should be removed. This crisis by far transcended the history of the hemisphere, and its repercussions outside it are best discussed elsewhere. So far as Latin American history is concerned, even though the United States promised not to invade Cuba, it went on trying to isolate it as much as possible from its neighbors. Unsurprisingly, the appeal of Cuba's revolution, nevertheless, seemed for a while to gain ground among the young of other Latin American countries. This did not make their governments more sympathetic towards Castro, especially when he began to talk of Cuba as a revolutionary center for the rest of the continent. In the event, as an unsuccessful attempt in Bolivia showed, revolution was not likely to prove easy. Cuban circumstances had been very atypical. The hopes entertained of mounting peasant rebellion elsewhere proved illusionary. Local communists in other countries deplored Castro's efforts. Potential recruits and materials for revolution turned out to be on the whole urban rather than rural and middle class rather than peasants. It was in the major cities that guerrilla movements were within a few years making the headlines. Despite being spectacular and dangerous, it is not clear that they enjoyed wide popular support, even if the brutalities practiced in dealing with them alienated support from authoritarian governments in some countries. Anti Americanism, meanwhile, continued to run high. Kennedy's hopes for a new American initiative based on social reform, an alliance for progress, as he termed it, made no headway against the animosity aroused by the American treatment of Cuba. His successor as president, Lyndon Johnson, did no better, perhaps because he was less interested in Latin America than in domestic reform. The initiative was never recaptured after the initial flagging of the alliance. Worse still, it was overtaken in 1965 by a fresh example of the old Adam of intervention, this time in the Dominican Republic, where 4 years before American help had assisted the overthrow and assassination of a corrupt and tyrannical dictator and his replacement by a reforming democratic government. When this was pushed aside by soldiers acting in defense of the privileged who felt threatened by the reform, the Americans cut off aid. It looked as if, after all, the Alliance for Progress might be used discriminately. But aid was soon restored, as it was to other right wing regimes. A rebellion against the soldiers in 1965 resulted in the arrival of 20,000 American troops to put it down. By the end of the decade, the alliance had virtually been forgotten, in part because of the persistent fears of communism, which led American policy to put its weight behind conservatives everywhere in Latin America. in part because the United States had plenty of other pressing problems. One ironic result was a new wave of attacks on United States property interests by governments that did not have to fear the loss of American support, while the communist threat seemed to endure. Chile nationalized the largest American copper company. The Bolivians took over oil concerns and the Peruvians American owned plantations. In 1969, there was a historic meeting of Latin American governments at which no United States representative was present, and Yankee behavior was explicitly and implicitly condemned. A tour undertaken by a representative of President of the United States that year led to protest riots, the blowing up of American property, and requests to stay away from some countries. It was rather like the end of the previous decade, when a goodwill tour by Eisenhower's vice president ended in his being mobbed and spat upon. All in all, it looked by 1970 as if Latin American nationalism was entering a new and vigorous period. If Cuba inspired guerrillas had ever presented a danger, they appeared to do so no longer. Once the spur of the internal fear was gone, there was little reason for governments not to try to capitalize on anti American feeling. Yet the real problems of Latin America were not being met. The 1970s and still more, the 1980s revealed chronic economic troubles, and by 1985, observers would speak of an apparently insoluble crisis. There were several sources for this. For all its rapid industrialization, the continent was threatened by intimidating population growth, which began to be obvious just as the difficulties of Latin American economies were again beginning to show their intractability. The aid program of Alliance for Progress patently failed to cope with them, and failure spawned quarrels over the use of American funds. Mismanagement produced huge foreign debts, which crippled attempts to sustain investment and achieve better trade balances. Social divisions remained menacing. Even the most advanced Latin American countries displayed vast discrepancies of wealth and education. Constitutional and democratic processes, where they existed, seemed increasingly impotent in the face of such problems. In the 1960s and 1970s, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay all underwent prolonged authoritarian rule by soldiers, and there were plenty of people willing to believe that only authoritarianism could bring about changes which normally democratic and civilian government had proved incapable. In the 1970s, the world began to hear more of torture and violent repression from countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, once regarded as civilized and constitutional states. Chile had enjoyed a longer and more continuous history of constitutional government than most of its neighbors, which lasted until in the 1970s election. A divided right led in a minority socialist coalition. When the new government embarked upon measures that brought economic chaos and seemed to be slipping further leftwards and even into a breakdown into lawlessness, the outcome was in 1973 a military coup that had United States approval and undercover support. Yet many Chileans, frightened by what looked like a worsening situation, went along with it too, in the belief that the overthrown government had been under communist control. Chile's new and authoritarian military government soon showed it had no qualms in mounting a brutal and wide ranging persecution of its opponents and critics, using the most savage methods to do so. In the end, it rebuilt the economy and even in the late 1980s began to look as if it might be able to restrain itself. But it drove ideological division deeper into Chilean society than the country had ever hitherto known. And that country became the outstanding symbol of dangers undoubtedly latent in other Latin American countries. Nor were all of these the same kind. By the 1970s, Colombia was already engaged in a civil war, still raging as the next century began, fed by struggles to control the country's huge production of cocaine, virtually partitioning the country. On a troubled and distracted continent, there had fallen, to cap its trouble, the oil crisis of the early 1970s. It sent the foreign debt problems of its oil importing countries, that is, most of them other than Mexico and Venezuela, out of control. In the next 2 decades, many economic remedies were to be tried in one country or another, but all turned out to be unworkable or unenforceable. It seemed impossible to deal with runaway inflation, interest charges on external debt, the distortion in resource allocation arising from past bad government, and administrative and cultural shortcomings which nourished corruption. In 1979, the Argentinian government was overthrown by popular unrest, and in the next decade, the Argentinians experienced an inflation of 20,000%. Latin America still appeared to be, perhaps more than ever, an explosive, disturbed continent of nations growing less and less like one another, for all their shared roots except in their distress. To the layers of differentiation laid down by Indian, slave, colonial, and post colonial experiences, all strongly reflected in differences of economic well being, had now been added new divisions brought by the arrival in the 1950s and 1960s of the assumptions of developed high technology societies whose benefits were available to the better off, but not to the poor. Just as in Asia, though it has been less obvious, the strains of the impact of modern civilization on historically deep rooted societies are now more visible than ever before, even if Latin America has been undergoing some of them since the 16th century. But in the 1980s, they were expressed additionally through the terrorism displayed by radicals and authoritarians alike, and they had continued to threaten civilized and constitutional standards achieved earlier. In the 1990s, however, there took place what looked like a major restoration of constitutional and democratic government and economic recovery in the major Latin American states. In all of them, military government was formally set aside. Eventually, only Cuba was left as an overtly non democratic regime. This helped to produce better hemisphere relations. Argentina and Brazil both agreed to close their nuclear weapon programs, while in 1991 they, together with Paraguay and Uruguay, agreed to set up a common market, Mercosur, which at once launched a major tariff cutting exercise. In 1996, Chile adhered to it. This promising atmosphere was troubled only by a few attempted coups, while economic conditions held up. Unhappily, those conditions began to falter continent wide in the middle of the decade, and by the end of it, the IMF had to mount new operations to rescue both Argentina and Brazil from severe troubles. Ominously, although the former had tied its currency to the United States dollar, itself a source of some of its difficulties, Brazil was again beginning to show the effects of inflation, while Argentina's debt to foreigners had risen out of control. The international community braced itself to face a repudiation of unprecedented size. As 2001 came to an end, the population of Buenos Aires again took to the streets, and after some bloodshed and casting out three presidents in 10 days, appeared to face a renewal of deflation and hard times. The early 2000s showed clearly the winners and losers in the economic growth that was beginning to take hold in most Latin American countries. While the economies of many countries grew more rapidly than they had done since the 1950s, the domestic returns of these advances were unevenly divided among the population. Brazil, for instance, is by most standards the most unequal society on earth. While the most advanced 10% of its 170 million population have a living standard that equals the EU average. The poorest 50% have seen little progress during the 1990s. The elections in many Latin American countries of left wing governments in the early 2000s reflect the preoccupation with growing inequality. But even the radical leaders, who span from the Venezuelan firebrand populist Hugo Chavez to the moderate socialist presidents Michelle Bachelet in Chile, elected 2006, and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, elected 2003, are unwilling to touch the market oriented reforms of the previous decades, which are widely held to have produced the first economic progress these countries have experienced for more than a generation. It is therefore likely that the contradiction between economic growth and abject poverty will remain the key issue in Latin America's development for years to come.